Chapter 1. The characteristics and purpose of the private security industry. Let's go through some definitions. Firstly, security. Security is simply the protection of a person, building, or organization from crime. Then, what is the need for a private security industry? The private security industry is helping support the police and government in day-to-day security operations. Security is provided in three ways. We've got manned security, which is people like yourselves with your licenses working on a premises. Physical security, that's like locks, padlocks, locked doors, bars on windows, any physical barriers. And system security, things like alarms and CCTV cameras in operation on a site. The purpose of the private security industry is to 1. Prevent loss and waste, 2. Provide personnel, 3. To monitor and respond to safety concerns, and 4. To provide systems to people and premises. The Security Industry Authority, or SIA, has certain tasks, and these are: it reports to the government, it's an independent body set up to enforce the regulation of the private security industry, it reduces criminality and raises standards within the private security industry, it's empowered under the Private Security Industry Act of 2001, it's responsible for the compulsory licensing of individuals, and is also responsible for the approved contractor scheme which is set up with businesses. Now, you're all sitting in this classroom or doing this e-learning because of an Act of Parliament. This Act of Parliament was passed in 2001, and that's why it's called the Private Security Industry Act of 2001. It came into law in 2003, and in order to enforce this law, the SIA came into power. So the Security Industry Authority is essentially the guardian of that law. Their job is to raise standards and to protect the public from all people in the private security industry. This came about because prior to that time, there was no licensing required. You didn't need to go on a course, and essentially people were getting hurt by people working on doors and in the security sector. So what happened was, in the late 80s, the police ran a project which looked into licensing. And licensing originally was planned on the local government level. So what that was it was looking at councils issuing licenses to people who were working in security, primarily looking at door supervisors. The problem with this is, if you're working in one council, you would have a license to work in that council. However, if you're moving around in an area that has a lot of different authorities, such as the City of London, for example, where there's over 32 different London boroughs, it's very difficult to have licenses for every single one, and quite expensive for you as well. So this was all taken into consideration. At that point, there was also no law that was national that covered everything that needed to be taught. And in fact, a lot of councils would have various degrees of what you needed to complete in order to get a license. Some were simply a criminal record check and you would get a license. Others would be far more in depth. They would send you on some physical training, some police units would be coming in to teach you some restraints, first aid could be taught, fire safety could be taught, but there wasn't any national course curriculum. This changed with the Private Security Industry Act coming into force. Training became standardized, so it didn't matter whether you were in southern England or whether you were in north of England, you would still be doing the exact same course with the same parameters. The SIA also, every 5 years, has to improve standards. So you'll see, if you've gone on a course prior, you'll see that the course has got longer and has perhaps developed a lot more than your previous course you may have attended. One of the SIA's roles is to continuously improve the private security industry. So over time, and I've been teaching for many, many years, the course has evolved. Every 4 or 5 years, a new course will come out to take over from the previous course. For instance, the door supervision course used to be 4 days and was a lot more simple than it is today. Today's course is 6 days and has a lot more detail and a lot more information in it than it previously did. Something else to remember is that the SIA is mainly here to protect the public. That's why we wear a license. We are fully responsible for our actions, and the SIA can remove anybody's license if they feel they are not behaving the way they should be. This could involve using too much force to restrain somebody, detaining somebody without the real reason to do so, or simply not acting as a professional security operative. Let's take a moment and talk a little bit about the SIA in a few more details. They report to the government. They are empowered by the Private Security Industry Act. And part of what they do, one of the main items that they do, is the compulsory licensing of any individual working in the private security industry. The SIA is known as a quango, which is essentially called a quasi-autonomous non-governmental organization, which means they're not the government as such, but they are part of the Home Office. They're essentially independent of whichever government's in power. Whereas if you look at, say, a local authority, for example, they'll have elections, and actually people working in certain sectors of that authority may change with governmental changes. Quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations do not change with governments. The SIA are also there to reduce criminality in the private security industry. The SIA also run the Approved Contractor scheme, which is set up for private companies. And essentially this is a voluntary scheme where if you tick certain boxes and you have very high standards, you can apply to join this Approved Contractor scheme. Benefits of doing this as a company is that you are then listed on the SIA website and people can search your company, and it puts again the general public at ease that your company has higher standards than, say, a company that wasn't approved by the SIA. Now, in order to receive your SIA license, you need to have certain minimum requirements. Number one, the SIA will not issue a license to anybody under the age of 18. So you must be aged 18 or over in order to apply for your license. Some of the courses have got younger ages to attend. For example, a CCTV course, you only have to be 16 to attend. A security officer course, you only have to be 16 to attend. However, the door supervision course, you do have to be 18 to attend this course. And this means you have to be 18 on the start day of the course. So it's very important, if you are under the age of 18 and you're booking a course, that you make sure that day one of that course you have already turned 18. Otherwise, your exams won't be marked and you will actually have to come back on the course again. The next thing is you cannot have a criminal record that isn't spent. And what I mean by that is the SIA will automatically carry out a DBS check on you. This check will check the last 5 years of your history, and it will flag certain offenses. The SIA's website does have a free criminal history checker where if you do have any record in the past, you can put this information into the system and it will give you feedback as to when you should be able to apply for your license. So if you're unsure, the best thing to do is to check that system. Also, you must attend a regulated SIA course and achieve the qualification before you can apply for your license. And lastly, you must have the right to work in the UK. And the SIA will carry out checks to make sure that you do have the right to work in the UK before issuing a license. If you're working in any of the following sectors in the private security industry, you will need a license issued by the SIA. That's for door supervisors, CCTV operatives, close protection operatives, security officers, and cash and values in transit. Now, if you're a key holder, you do need to have an SIA license, and quite often dog handlers have to have an SIA license as well. However, there is no dog handler license and there is no key holder license. So normally what happens is people will do a door supervision or security officer license in order to work in the private security industry doing their specific sector. What you might notice if you look on the SIA website is that vehicle immobilization is still there as a license. Please be aware that's only for Northern Ireland. From 2012, vehicle immobilization was no longer licensable in England or Wales, and in fact, clamping vehicles is not allowed by the private security industry. Part of the SIA's role is to keep records of everybody who holds a license. So the details they hold is things like your license number, your name and surname, whether your license is frontline or non-frontline, the status of your license, i.e. is your license live, expired, or perhaps suspended, or revoked, and if there's any change to your license condition, when did that change take place? For example, if your license expired, it would simply say expired next to it and the date that the license expired. If the license was suspended, it would also have the date of that suspension, or of course, if the license was revoked, it would also have the date of that. Now, this is a public document, meaning that when you're licensed, anyone can search you on the SIA's database and it would give those details across to anybody looking. This goes back to protection of the public. This is a public document, and these records are freely available for anybody who wants to search for them. They would simply go onto the SIA's website and carry out a search on the Registered License Holders tab. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to have a little look at the licenses and expand a little bit on what sector each one is covering and what exactly that license is for. So if we start with a door supervision license, essentially it's the most common security license that's issued by the SIA. The main difference between the door supervision license and the security officer license is that the door supervision license allows you to work on a licensed premises where alcohol is served and, most importantly, consumed on that premises. Whereas a security officer license, whilst you can work on a licensed premises, such as a Tesco or a Morrison's or a shop, retail shop, something like that, essentially that license is for takeaway only, so not consumption on the site. The difference is the door supervision deals a little bit more with, say, escorting people off a property, using physical intervention, which is not required for the security officer course at all. So the security officer cannot work on a licensed premises where alcohol is consumed. The door supervisor can, but the door supervisor actually can also work in a licensed premises where alcohol is not consumed on site. So essentially the door supervisor license is more flexible, allowing you to work in a number of different locations, including licensed premises, festivals where alcohol is served and consumed, retail security, as well as concierge, front of house security, and even reception security. All of that can be done using the door supervision license, while the restriction on the security officer license is that whilst a lot of those jobs can be done, the restriction is you cannot work on a premises where alcohol is then consumed on site. CCTV licenses are required if you're working as a third-party private security industry operative, and you're carrying out public space surveillance. Now, public space surveillance means that your cameras are panning, tilting, and zooming in on the general public moving through an area. It might be private property, but it's still the general public moving through. So if you think of like shopping malls, things like that, those are private property, but in order to work there as a third-party private security company, you do need to have your CCTV license. Now that license will allow you to track people and to zoom in on people, and to do so, part of the training for that license essentially will cover things like data protection, the rights of the individual, human rights, and that kind of stuff. So that's the CCTV license. Key holders, as mentioned before, simply have to be licensed, but there's not really a specification on which license they hold. It's normally the door supervision license or the security operative license that they would hold. Then you have cash and values in transit, or CVIT. If you're working in CVIT, you are most likely going to be working, driving a cash in transit van, picking up funds and transferring funds between banks, or picking up funds from private companies and delivering them to the bank. Some other key bodies of interest are the police. Obviously, we work closely with the police in carrying out our duties. The SIA, which I've mentioned a number of times, which is the Security Industry Authority. They are the authority that we deal with to get our licenses, as well as the enforcers of the Private Security Industry Act. The NSI, or National Security Inspectorate, and other trade associations as well. The BSIA, or British Security Associates, as well as, of course, local authorities and local councils, and British Standards, which is the UK's national standards body. The SIA's Code of Behaviour is a strict code of conduct that everybody working in the private security industry must follow. Simple things like being courteous, being polite and professional at all times, not discriminating, and treating everybody fairly are all included in this. All security operatives are expected to be reliable, be courteous, and be polite, as well as be professional at all times, be well dressed. Now, how you dress will actually be determined by who you're working for. For example, you might be working for a company that has a very strict dress code or a uniform, or it might be simply that you must wear dark colors and it's not as in detailed as, say, a security company that has a strict uniform policy. Above all, when you're wearing your license, you must be responsible. That means you must act in a responsible manner and completely take ownership of everything that you do. Some of the key skills that the security operative should possess is, number one, most importantly, you must be a good communicator. That means you must be good at listening, you must be good at showing empathy, showing understanding of somebody else's point of view. You must listen clearly to what they have to say and maybe what other people have to say as well around them to try and draw a clear picture of what's going on before acting. Speaking of communication, always remember that communication is a two-way process. Both parties must understand each other in order for communication to be successful. Also, don't forget, quite often you're part of a team. Now, this could be a very small team or it could be a very large team. But you must always remember that you're not on your own. You should work as part of this team if you have other members of the team. It's very easy to get drawn into a situation, and before you're thinking properly, you've run into a situation, you've not called for backup, and now you're outnumbered and you're standing in something that's going off rails very quickly. So it's important to think ahead of the game and call for backup if you think it's necessary prior to engaging in conversation. However, we also don't want to overreact to situations that we could probably resolve by just having a calm demeanor and talking calmly to get everybody back down to a level where they can comply. Also remember, some things we do may be sensitive in nature. Information we hold will be critical information that shouldn't be shared with anyone. So, for example, if you're working in a very safety-critical, security-critical building, you shouldn't be sharing any inside information with anybody, including friends and family. This comes back to responsibility. When you're licensed, you are responsible, so you must act responsibly. When working in the private security industry, there's really two elements you need to bear in mind at all times. One is the SIA's own code of behavior, which we discussed previously, and the other is, of course, your own company's standards and procedures. Now, normally you will have some company manual or procedure guidelines. You should read this thoroughly to understand your roles and responsibilities in the job you do. You may also be working with third parties as part of crime reduction initiatives. Crime reduction initiatives are normally run by local authorities in partnership with the police as well as local security to help reduce crime and increase the public safety. Some examples of those could be, in older days, we used to have something called Pub Watch, where we would have meetings every month or two, or maybe every month or three, with the local police and local authorities, and they would go through any problems that we were currently facing in, say, the nighttime economy. That now has been replaced, but now we've got things such as PubLink, and this is a system where all pubs, clubs, and bars in the nighttime economy are linked, and during the day, all the shops are linked via radio to a central control room, which is normally in the council. What happens there is, if any crime takes place or any safety concerns happen, the security members on the ground have a direct link to the council, which they can then call on a radio for quick access to the council to get, say, cameras onto a situation, which then can start to build evidence, as well as most councils will have a direct link with the police using a system like Airwave, which is an encrypted radio system, to directly pass information live to the police. Now, this helps tremendously in fighting crime, as well as getting evidence post-crime to help with prosecutions as well. In both the nighttime and the daytime economies, third-party private security companies may be working closely with the police. Now, normally this is done via a police liaison officer. A police liaison officer is somebody who is going to share information about the bigger security picture, share upcoming potential events, ongoing troubles, issues with potentially, say, drink spiking or crime in the area, and initiatives that we can all take to make things safer for the general public. Some local authorities in the nighttime economy have started using something called a red card, yellow card program. What this is if we're working on a licensed premises and something was to go wrong, a red card essentially means that that license for that premises is then revoked and essentially the venue can't operate anymore. So that's not very good news for everybody working there, because essentially that place is now shut. Instead of giving a red card, in certain cases the council is looking to work with the venue to increase and improve its security if security was the problem, or it might be antisocial behavior or something along that nature. So they could give the venue a yellow card. In a yellow card scenario, it's essentially like a final warning of get everything together, and start doing things properly. So there'll be a list of things that the venue itself needs to comply with in order to come off that yellow card. This is just a new way of doing something that used to happen in the past. So when a venue gets in trouble, especially in the nighttime economy, this will normally be because of a complaint made by someone, or the police have been called for a big incident. Normally what will happen is they'll look at the license conditions for that venue, see what security arrangements have been made, and are there any changes that need to be made. Now, if this venue is constantly having problems, there may be a very strict stance taken by the council, in which case they may revoke the license entirely, similar to a red card. Or if the venue's not really had any problems before, and maybe they don't even have any security because their original license didn't require it, the venue may then receive a warning with a list of tasks that they have to complete, which would be like a yellow card. One of those tasks might be you now must have X amount of door staff or security staff working between certain hours. So for example, if the venue is open from 11 a.m. Till 3 a.m., they might have on the license that from 6 p.m. till closing times on, say, a Friday night and a Saturday night, which is historically the busier nights, that's where you've got to have X amount of door staff on duty. And if you don't do that, then they will pull the license and essentially give the venue a red card. Another thought on the yellow card is, of course, it's not there to punish people, but essentially it's there to improve potentially venues that are working under the carded system. Remember also that not all councils work on the red card, yellow card system. Remember, the councils are independent to a degree, so some might enforce that and others might not. You need to check where you work whether this type of scheme is in operation. Now let's look at some basic ways to improve safety, public safety, and reduce crime in an area. A couple of very basic things might be simple things and quite cost-effective things. One of these items might be simply put better lights up. If you think about a dark alleyway, for example, would you walk down that in the middle of the night? Probably not. But if there was a floodlight in that alleyway, there's less likely for people to be trying to commit crimes down there. If there was a floodlight and a camera, obviously in that alleyway, the likelihood of crime taking place is much, much lower, and therefore public safety is increased. There's always a balance here. We can't have a camera on every street looking in everybody's window. That would be a massive breach of data protection. Certain things can be done to remove the opportunity for crime to take place. Some very basic things. Installing better lighting, for example. Lighting up an alleyway which would otherwise remain pitch black in the middle of the night would heavily reduce the chances of crime taking place. Installing CCTV cameras will even further reduce crime taking place, and if crime does take place, act as a very positive way of gathering evidence to hand over to police in their investigations, which may well help solve any crimes that have taken place. Other basic things are controlling access and egress, essentially controlling who comes onto the property, making sure IDs are checked if your building requires that, and making sure that we know where people are going and who they're visiting if they are not from that property. Better physical security, making sure gates are closed, doors are locked overnight, and the building is essentially secure, including fire exits. Some buildings may have padlocked fire exits during the day, for example nightclubs, when there's no members of the public inside that building. Part of our fire safety checks would be to remove those padlocks and make sure that those doors are functioning and openable in the case of an emergency as soon as the public's on board. But as soon as the public leaves at the end of the night or early hours of the morning, we need to make that building secure. You'll find a lot of fire exits are a weak spot as far as security is concerned about gaining access from the outside. A lot of these doors are quite old. They may not lock or close properly on their normal locking mechanism, which is why we'd have to add that secondary padlock to them and chain just to make sure that they are securely locked overnight. Another key element is, of course, cooperation. So if we're working with outside agencies, we're working with the council, we're working with the police using radios, it makes the security function far, far better than if we were working on our own. This includes working within our company with our colleagues, as well as external agencies as well, such as the police or local authorities or CCTV operators within both our company or our building, as well as external CCTV cameras potentially working for a council. Another key element is working and liaising with other companies in the area also providing security. Essentially, we're all doing the same job, and it works much better if we work together. One of the first things you need to do when you get that first job is familiarize yourselves with either what is called the SOPs, which is the standard operating procedures, also known as AIs, which is the assignment instructions. Now, all of these are going to be different, and it might be different from site to site as well. For example, I might be working for a security company which has multiple contracts, and one company I have a contract with, I work on that site one day, and they've got a set of assignment instructions, and then I go to a different site with a different company, same security provider, but different company, say a different shop. They might have a very different set of assignment instructions. Now, the assignment instructions are essentially there to protect us. We need to read them, we need to understand them, and we need to stick to them. If you go off assignment instructions, you can't go wrong. If you start listening to other people, say a manager of the building telling you to chase somebody down the road who's stolen a packet of crisps, and you chase that person down the road, your insurance is unlikely to pay you. And if anything was to happen, for example, that person ran out in front of a bus and got hit by the bus, you are liable then personally for that person's injury. And in a worst case scenario, you can be held for manslaughter as a result of somebody being run over, being chased by you. So it's very, very serious stuff. No assignment instructions would ever instruct you to do anything like that. It will be very clear where your authority ends and where you need to stop a chase if you had to give chase to someone. Also, what is reasonably expected of you as well. These are always written with the law in mind, so there will be nothing in there that can be seen as illegal. So again, as long as you follow your assignment instructions to the letter, you should be 100% legal in everything you do. Assignment instructions are drawn up by the security company in partnership with whoever the contract is for. For example, if it's a supermarket, a chain, normally at upper management level, at head office, they'll sit down and they'll draw up the security contract, which will eventually become the assignment instructions, which are passed down to you working on the door of that premises. It's very important that you do understand that it may vary from site to site. So it might be site specific, it might be company specific, and of course, whichever security provider you're working for, it'll be specific to them as well. So be sure whenever you go to a new site to always check over the assignment instructions, make sure you know what to do in an emergency, a fire emergency, a terrorist attack. What exactly are your roles and responsibilities? This should all be covered very clearly in your assignment instructions. And as always, if you're unclear on anything, always ask your line manager to clarify whatever you're not sure about. Assignment instructions cover your day-to-day operation. Things like important phone numbers are in there, processes and procedures. For example, if you're carrying out searches, you may be working where you're doing staff searching. So what the process is if someone refuses a search, what the process is if you find something on somebody. These are all detailed in the assignment instructions. Important phone numbers will be in there, who to contact, who your line managers are, structure of the company. All of that is inside your assignment instructions. Other things covered in your assignment instructions could be things like your radio procedures, call signs, as well as any patrols you've got to carry out, how often you carry these out, and exactly where you are going to patrol when you do carry out a patrol. Of course, when you receive these, you'll be asked to read them. Some of them might be quite small, some of them might be quite thick. It's very important that you do read them, because more often than not, you're going to be asked to sign and date to say that you have read them. Now, this is the company you're working for making sure they're covering themselves as well. So that essentially, if you do carry out something that's not in those assignment instructions, for example, you hold somebody on the ground and injure them, and that's not in your assignment instructions to do so, the company is essentially going to wash their hands and say, hey, that wasn't in your assignment instructions and you did it anyway. Now, the excuse of, but the manager told me to do it, will not stand up in court. You'll be left on your own, and most likely your insurance isn't going to cover you either. So you need to be very, very clear that when you do sign to say you read these, that you actually did read them. Because if you didn't, you're actually probably going to cause more problems for yourself than not. The use of CCTV within the private security industry is very widespread, as you probably know. It can be used from everything from access control, so in other words, in a very secure building where you don't have necessarily windows looking outside. Instead, you may have camera access. Things like cash centers and distribution centers would probably operate like that. It can help with traffic flow. Highways agency use them to make sure that the traffic is flowing well. They are actively monitoring to see if anyone's broken down in these sort of smart motorways that are built today. They can, of course, be used to record evidence and pass that evidence across to the police. Bear in mind, witness statements are and witness evidence as such are pretty weak forms of evidence, because what tends to happen with people and humans is that when an incident occurs, quite often, especially if they're not used to violence or anything major, they'll misremember situations. So under stress, timings will be out, the order of things happening will be out, but a camera won't do that. The camera will simply record the evidence as is happening in front of it. As long as it's in the way of the camera and under the camera's shot, you can see everything that's going on and it'll record all that data. Now, obviously, the downside of that is, of course, quite often you might not see the whole incident under camera, but at least partially you might be able to determine who did what to who, and of course maybe identify the people involved. Cameras are also used to help in access control. They also help reduce the number of staff required to carry out safe patrols of a building or environment, because again, instead of having to go on a foot patrol around the perimeter of the building, you may have cameras positioned around that perimeter, which will allow you to simply sit in a control room and view all the corners of the building without having to actively go out on foot. This again is safety for the operator as well, because a lone security operator, for example, going outside to investigate a noise or something like that is of course at a higher risk. Of course, if you're having to do foot patrols around a site and you're a single crew, you also might have to navigate a lot of stairs. There's more chance of slipping and falling. So overall, the CCTV systems there help on that side as well. Cameras also really help to deter crime. For example, if someone was looking to carry out a crime and they saw a building that had no cameras, they're far more likely to go and attempt to carry out the crime with that building, such as breaking and entering, burglaring, whatever it might be, rather than a building that's got very clear cameras in operation, as this acts as a deterrent, because they know they're going to be seen on camera and there's a high likelihood that their ID is going to be simply recorded and then passed to the police later. Of course, if we are using CCTV, there are legal implications. Number one, if it's a third-party security operator running the CCTV system, then that security operator, i.e. yourself, would have to have completed a CCTV PSS, or Public Space Surveillance course, pass that and have a CCTV license with them at all times when they're operating. Secondary to that, there is of course a lot of data protection legislation as well as human rights legislation to be taken into account when we're using CCTV. If a company is using CCTV, the Information Commissioner's Office must be notified and the cameras must be registered. Any camera operation in public space has to be registered with the ICO, or Information Commissioner's Office. Secondary to that, there also must be very clear signage up stating that CCTV is in operation, and also a contact number of the data controller where any kind of complaints or requests can be made. And essentially, complaints or requests could be anything along the lines of, I'm a member of the public, I'm walking past the building, and I see a camera, and I look and I think, oh, that camera could see in my house. I have every right to make a subject access request in order to see exactly what information is being recorded here. The data controller has to respond to this, and they would have to show that, say for example, if that was the case, there was blanking software being used to protect the front of that house. So a camera for public space cannot look inside somebody's private residence. If the camera could see inside there, that would be a massive breach of data protection. We do have software solutions, and software solutions are things like blanking software. Essentially, if you imagine it's just a big pixelated black spot or pixelated spot where the operator cannot see behind. So essentially it's just like blacked out, so no one can see in there. So if anyone makes that request to look at that, they have the right to see it and to show that their personal information and their private property is being protected. Moreover, of course, CCTV cameras cannot record everywhere. There are certain areas that are fully protected, such as changing rooms, toilets and facilities like that, where CCTV cameras are either going to be strictly controlled, i.e. have a lot of blanking software up, or in most cases they just simply don't operate there at all. This is down to data protection and human rights law. When we talk about personal data and the collection of personal data, what we are actually referring to is any image that somebody is identifiable on. So for example, if I'm zoomed out and I've got a person walking across a screen, and that person is taking up about roughly 10% of the screen, it's not likely that this would be classified as personal data because the person's not clearly identifiable. If, however, I zoom in and that person is then clearly identifiable, that image falls under data protection legislation at that point. Now, what does that mean? It means that it has to be protected. It means that the storage of that data has to be for a set time. Now, the law doesn't state how long that time is, but essentially it says it's got to be held for a reasonable amount of time. So if anyone ever requested how long you're holding my data for, maybe not you as the operator, but the company and the data controller has to justify the length of time that the data will be held for. A lot of CCTV camera systems will be recording and possibly hold for maybe a month or 40 days maximum, and that includes your councils. And then after that, the tapes are erased or the hard disks are erased and then recorded over again and starting from the beginning. So for example, if the police have an investigation to carry out and they need to get some data, most of them know quite quickly, like we've got to ask the council fairly rapidly for that image, because if we wait a month and a week, it's likely that the council is not going to be holding that data anymore. And of course, it's a practical element as well, because how much data and how long do you want to hold it for? Cameras today, you're looking at 4K, in some cases 8K images, running at 60 frames per second in some cases, although CCTV systems not often 60 frames because it's not really required, you don't need that kind of detail. However, it does take up data storage space as well, so you do have to have a sort of cut-off date of when we would release it. So it has to be reasonable. It has to be held for a reasonable length of time. Also, disclosure of the data. So if someone asks for data, it is up to the person who's had the request passed to them. It's their responsibility to make sure not to disclose that data unless it's authorized for them to get it. Data disclosure to public authorities and the police, normally that's no problem, and the police will have paperwork to fill out and they will get the authorization to take that evidence. If you're working in a council, you'll be dealing with the police on a day-to-day basis, and quite often they may not have the paperwork right away. We will still assist the police, and then later the police will come with their paperwork. In that situation, we'll always assist the police. If it's a third party, for example, you're looking at a road traffic collision, 2 cars involved, one of those cars, insurance company is now disputing with the other insurance company. Again, working for a council or perhaps even a private company, the CCTV operator may be requested by the insurance company to give information so that the insurance company can use that in their case. That would be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and you would have standard operating procedures and assignment instructions to tell you exactly what you can disclose, what you can't disclose, and of course, if you need to get some authority to clarify and clear it. It is possible that we would disclose information like that. However, it would probably be at a charge to the insurance company. And again, we would also need to clarify that it's not part of an ongoing police investigation. If it's part of an ongoing police investigation and any of that information relates to that, we would simply direct any request to the investigating officer of the police, and we would not disclose anything further than that. So that everybody who's come in and got access to that control room is signed in, and it is a full audit trail covered there as well. If you're ever working as a CCTV operator in a control room and you're unsure about disclosure or anything at all, Control rooms generally, especially the larger council control rooms, will not be you on your own. You'll always be a member of a shift. There'll be a shift team leader or supervisor, and you should always get clarification from the more experienced members if you're unsure about either disclosure or even data protection, or even zooming in on somebody and tracking their movements. You need to always clarify with a more senior colleague if you're unsure about any of this, and how it would perhaps impact that person's rights and the Data Protection Act. And remember, if you're a third-party private security company working in a control room, you will need to have an SIA license. There are exemptions to this, and for example, if you're working for a council, directly for the council, you won't need an SIA license. However, a lot of councils will put their members of staff through the SIA course to gather the knowledge and understanding of the legal implications of working in the industry prior to coming into the control room itself. So although they don't require the license, they may very well require the training. Obviously, CCTV is very, very good, very powerful, but there are certain limitations. Number one, of course, any crime that's taking place outside of the range of the camera won't be covered. It is expensive to install CCTV and possibly maintain CCTV. It can also be misused. If, as an operator, for example, you are zooming into somebody's private residence to watch them get changed, that is a sexual offense. So the chances are you are going to be convicted in court of a sexual offense, and you probably end up on the sexual offenders register as well. There is a very, very low threshold here of what is acceptable by a CCTV operator. However, there are certain times where recording perhaps a sexual act in a public place may be justified because maybe a crime is taking place there as well. More details of those type of things would be on a CCTV specific course. Other areas of limitation are, of course, vulnerability to damage and wear and tear, which can be expensive. The training involved to use the kit effectively. It's not just the practical kit, it could also be the software that is installed. The staff need to know and the operators need to know how to operate that, because without that training and knowledge, there's no point in having that software installed in the first place. And the software can be very expensive. So facial recognition, tracking software that can be built in. It's key that staff training is added to that cost as well, so that the kit is used to its best and maximum capabilities. The other thing, and the final thing really to note as a CCTV operator, is although crime can be prevented, not always. Sometimes you're going to be witnessing violent scenes in front of you, and you have to remain calm, and you have to remain collected, and you potentially are going to be passing that information live through via radio to the police, giving them live updates, especially if you're in a council. And your job there is to try and gather as much information as possible. You have to come to terms with the fact that you're not going to stop the crime from happening. So if someone's being attacked, you can't stop that. Your job here is to pass the information across to the police as best you can with as much detail as possible to get them on scene as quickly as possible, as well as, of course, recording images that will later be used potentially by both the police and the Crown prosecution in a prosecution of that crime. Further limitations could be wiring. That can be damaged as well, especially if there's a lot of wiring, so your cameras are quite far away. Once again, councils will normally have contracts with IP providers. Quite often they're using fiber optics. With fiber optics, it's a kind of on-off situation, so if a mouse or something is chewed through a cable, it's just going to go down. But quite often we'll have an engineer out very rapidly to solve that kind of problem. But it's still a limitation. Weather can also affect it as well, so if you've got direct sunlight in the lens, of course what's going to happen is the aperture is going to close off, and your image is going to get very dark. So the lens itself is going to focus on the sun. So you would have to adjust, if you could, that angle to try and get the sun out of the lens. Dirt buildup quite often can happen. We do have some mechanisms that can help us, little wipers. Newer cameras actually have a high frequency vibrate on as well, that they can vibrate the dirt off. Misting and fogging up can happen, of course, in humid weather. Again, one of the common things with the cameras, especially the high-mounted cameras that are hard to get to, is spiders, and wildlife like to build their houses there. And unfortunately, these can then cause the focal point of the camera to try and draw in to where the spider's crawling across the lens, which is never overly convenient if you are trying to track a suspect or pass information to the police or maybe take down a number plate. A lot of cameras can, of course, be manually taken over, but most of the CCTV suite is operated automatically. So you zoom in and the camera will refocus. There is a manual option there, but most often we just draw the camera back slightly, zoom slightly back out, and the camera will refocus, and you can zoom in for a clearer view of a number plate, for example, something like that. One other thing to consider is any camera that's got moving parts, any camera that's got a pan or tilt function, so panning is your left and right, you're tilting up and down. Well, it's got mechanical parts in it, and nothing lasts forever. So especially if it's made out of plastic components, sort of slightly cheaper, what we'll find is over time things degrade. Obviously weather, sun can cause items to crack and become less functionable over time. So it needs constant servicing. Potentially it may need repairs and replacement over time as well. Although technology is advancing at a rapid speed, control rooms still required personnel to operate to the most effective standards. The SIA's Approved Contractor Scheme is a scheme that is designed by the SIA to set higher standards to companies so that those companies meeting those standards can receive approved contractor status. Now, if a company has that approved contractor status, it may help them get better contracts, and it acts as a good advertisement for them because their company is then searchable on the SIA's database. Companies who are approved by the SIA on the Approved Contractor Scheme will also be subject to periodic inspections to make sure that those standards are still being upheld and they can uphold their approved contractor status. The Approved Contractor Scheme helps improve the public's trust in the security industry as a whole, as well as in that particular company, as well as a push for more continual professional development within those companies that are on the scheme. That concludes this section of your course. Please take your time now and take your quiz.